Welcome back to Crime and Consequence. We're going deep today on a case that's both fascinating and incredibly disturbing. The Christopher Dorner saga from 2013.
Yeah, it's a story that really did grab headlines back then. But behind all the sensationalism, I think there lies a really complex web of individual choices, systemic issues, and ultimately tragedy.
For sure, and we got a ton of material to dig into. Court documents, news reports, even Dorner's own manifesto. It's a chilling read, I have to say. I'm hoping that we can piece together not just the what of the events, but the why.
Yeah, and I think that's really key here. Understanding Dorner's motivations, obviously without condoning his actions, is crucial if we're going to learn anything from this case.
Absolutely, because when you look at it on the surface, you see this guy. Decorated Navy veteran, college grad, former LAPD officer. You'd think that's a recipe for success, not a descent into violence.
Right, and that's what makes this case so compelling to me. How does someone seemingly on that trajectory end up waging war on his former department?
Right.
We need to look beyond the headlines, to look at those really formative experiences. Military service, the pressures of being a black officer in the LAPD, the potential racial tensions within the department itself.
Okay, so let's rewind a little bit to the incident that seems to have been the catalyst for everything. Dorner's accusation of excessive force against his training officer. He claimed that she kicked a suspect who was already restrained.
And that's where things start to get, murky. You have these conflicting accounts, lack of clear-cut evidence, the legal battles that Dorner faced when he tried to report it. It raises this huge question. Did the system fail him even before he went rogue?
Because the internal investigation ultimately sided against Dorner, and they fired him for making false statements. He appealed it, fought it in court, but lost at every turn.
Yeah, and that sense of injustice, whether perceived or real, really fueled his rage. From his perspective, he was punished for trying to do the right thing. And that festered. It morphed into this desire for revenge.
And that's where the manifesto comes in. It's unsettling, to say the least. Dorner lays out all of his grievances against the LAPD, threatens specific officers and their families, and even tries to justify what he's planning to do.
Yeah, it's a window into his state of mind at that time. Anger, resentment, but also this chilling conviction that he's the righteous one, waging war against a corrupt system. He even uses military language, calling it unconventional and asymmetric warfare against the LAPD.
Wow. He even names names, calls out specific officers, the ones he believes were complicit in his firing, and fostering this culture of racism and brutality within the LAPD. He demands that they admit they were wrong and threatens violence if they don't comply.
And this put the LAPD in an impossible position. If they acknowledge his claims, even just to refute them, they risk giving him a platform, validating his perspective in the eyes of some. But ignoring the threats wasn't an option either, given their specificity and his clear capability for violence.
Which is how we end up with this terrifying manhunt as Dorner vanishes. And those threats become a deadly reality.
Yeah, the manhunt was intense. It completely dominated the news cycle. Every update just seemed to raise the stakes. People were terrified, wondering where he'd strike next, who would be the next victim.
And his first targets, they were deeply personal. Monica Kwan and her fiancé, Keith Lawrence, shot dead in their car. The really tragic twist to this is that Monica's father was the lawyer who'd represented Dorner during those LAPD hearings.
Right. And that attack, it made it very clear that this wasn't just about some broad grievances against the entire department. Dorner was targeting individuals connected to his case, which just ramped up the pressure on law enforcement even more.
And then he turns his focus on the police themselves. Ambushes 2 LAPD officers. One of them narrowly escapes a fatal headshot. Then minutes later, he attacks 2 more officers in Riverside, killing one and critically injuring the other.
It was a huge turning point. I mean, police officers were no longer just trying to apprehend a suspect. They were targets themselves. And the manhunt took on this whole new level of urgency and danger.
Yeah, and this is where Dorner's military background really comes into play. He's not just some disgruntled guy with a gun. He's trained in evasion and combat tactics. He manages to stay ahead of the massive resources that were thrown at finding him.
What's fascinating to me is the psychological aspect, too. His manifesto, those targeted killings, it's almost like he was trying to control the narrative, force people to see things from his perspective.
He even tries to steal a boat, maybe to escape to Mexico. The whole thing felt like something out of a movie, but with very real, very high stakes.
Absolutely. I mean, the entire region was on edge. Schools were locked down. People were warned to stay indoors. It wasn't just about finding Dorner at that point. It was about preventing further bloodshed.
Yeah, and eventually they track him to Big Bear Lake. They find his burned-out truck with evidence that he's trying to disappear into the wilderness. And a massive search effort gets underway.
That discovery was crucial, but the terrain was incredibly challenging. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Only the needle is armed and dangerous.
As we know, it didn't end peacefully. A violent confrontation at a remote cabin. Standoff ensues. The cabin goes up in flames. Dorner's found dead inside from a gunshot wound to the head.
But the fire itself raised a lot of questions. You know, the use of those pyrotechnic tear gas canisters, which are highly flammable, led some people to believe that the police intentionally burned the cabin down with Dorner inside.
Yeah, it sparked a huge debate about the tactics that were used. Was it justified, given the circumstances as such a dangerous suspect? Or did it cross the line, potentially violating Dorner's right to due process even as a fugitive?
It really highlights those ethical dilemmas, the ethical dilemmas that are inherent in law enforcement, balancing public safety with individual rights, making these split-second decisions in incredibly high-pressure situations. It's never black and white.
And then there's that tragic incident where LAPD officers mistakenly shot at 2 women during the manhunt. They thought that their truck matched Dorner's, but it was a case of mistaken identity.
Yeah, a stark reminder of the fog of war, so to speak, even with the best intentions. Mistakes can happen, and they can have devastating consequences. The LAPD ended up settling a multi-million-dollar lawsuit with those women, acknowledging that there were policy violations.
It really did damage to public trust. Because if even innocent people can get caught in the crossfire, it makes you wonder about accountability and oversight, and whether the system is truly equipped to handle these kinds of situations.
The Dorner case really exposed a lot of cracks in the system. It forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about police culture, racial bias, and the limits of accountability mechanisms.
Yeah, it really did. It shook people's faith in the system, in the idea that even when things go wrong, there's some process in place to right those wrongs.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes the aftermath so important to examine. It wasn't just about catching Dorner. It was about this reckoning with the systemic issues he had exposed.
So what did that reckoning look like? I mean, were there actual tangible changes within the LAPD as a result of all this?
There were some policy changes, especially around the use of force and the internal investigations of misconduct. They implemented stricter protocols, more oversight, to make sure that those mechanisms were actually working as intended.
And it wasn't just about rewriting the rules on paper, right? I mean, there had to be some kind of cultural shift as well.
Absolutely. One of the biggest changes that came out of this was the increased emphasis on mental health support for officers, recognizing the immense stress of the job, the potential for trauma, and making sure that there were resources available to address those issues proactively.
I guess Dorner, in his own twisted way, forced a conversation about these issues. The human cost was immense. But did it ultimately lead to a more self-aware, more accountable law enforcement system?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think the Dorner case definitely served as a wake-up call, a stark reminder that even those who are sworn to uphold the law are fallible, susceptible to the same pressures and failings as anyone else.
Yeah, it does. It leaves us with some unsettling questions, though. Could something like this happen again? Are we doing enough to prevent future tragedies?
Those are questions that we all need to grapple with. I don't think there's an easy answer. But by continuing to have these difficult conversations, by demanding transparency and accountability from our institutions, we can hopefully create a system that's more just, more resilient, and less likely to produce another Christopher Dorner.
It's a heavy thought to end on, but an important one. The Dorner case is a tragic reminder of the complexities of justice, the destructive power of revenge, and the human cost of a system gone wrong. It's a story that continues to resonate today, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths and strive for a better way forward. See you next time on Crime and Consequence.